Thank you for joining me for the talk that I gave to Carlops village in the autumn of 2020. We're going to join the talk just as I'm beginning to explain why I became a general practitioner and the influence that the local practitioner in West Linton had on me as a young boy. Just see if we can work out why I became a doctor in the first place. I don't know if any of you have seen this little video, which will just play nicely for us. And as it's playing, you may recognize this place. This is the nearest thing I could find to, I mean, this is obviously Edwardian, so I'm not that old, but this was the best pictures I could see that reminded me of the village that I was brought up in, especially this burn, which Dad will tell you I spent far too much time in, usually filling my wellies before I came home. That was one of my favorite spots. And when I was in the village, I knew who I wanted to be. And I'll just read you this little bit from the beginning of the book. I say we're not that old. We didn't have horses and carts in those days. I am who I am, and I will be who I will be. For a young boy to know this before leaving primary school is unusual. But this one did. Not only did he know what he wanted to be, but he knew who. He'd seen the man walking down the main street of his village for many years. He'd watched his confidence enter the room ahead of him. He saw it part the smoke of the coal fires and brush aside the smell of paraffin and ignore the scent of the crisp cleanliness of a newly made bed. This boy carefully observed the nuances of the man's conversation, the details of the examinations, his use of percussions, of lookings and listenings with strange instruments. He marveled at the strange writing on the pad of paper, drawn from the worn leather bag placed at the foot of the bed. And some of you will actually know who I'm talking about there, but the GP in the village when I was young was Dr. Mackenzie. Along with those of you from Carlops will remember Dr. Jack. Stayed on the main street there with you. And I wanted to be Dr. Mackenzie. I wanted to be a practitioner in a small rural practice. And unfortunately, I didn't succeed in the first step of that journey. I'm just going to admit Alistair, and then he'll be much happier. So just let me stop that screen share and start another screen share, and we'll just have another little look. Technology is wonderful. So here we are, close to where the heart gives out, which is the story of our first year, Maggie and I. Maggie's listening, you've seen her behind me, in Orkney when we moved up to the little island of Edie. But I wanted just to pop this up here. This is 1969, our school year just before we went up to high school. Some faces you may recognize there. I've got maybe about half of them now, I think, if I remember rightly. And in case you're wondering where I am, there I am in the back there, looking considerably more handsome than I do now. I spent the day, because I found this picture just today, I spent the day going along the road trying to name everybody, and I nearly succeeded. But this little boy, at the age of, I suppose he's 11 going on 12 there, knew that he wanted to be a general practitioner. I never wanted to be anything else. That was what I set off to do at university and succeeded, but didn't end up where I thought I would, because we ended up in suburban Glasgow. I met Maggie and we ended up in suburban Glasgow. Became unhappy there, and you can read in the book just why we became unhappy and the various kind of thoughts that went through my mind. Unhappy to the extent that we started to apply for other posts, and the first one we applied for was actually the job on Isla. Didn't get that job, and the next post that came up was one in Orkney. And we were certain that the advert was incorrect because it said to come and look after 125 people on this island, which is Edie, in the North Isles. We were pretty certain that must be 1,250, and they just missed a zero off the back of the number, but they hadn't. We were successful and got the job. So we were off to the island of Edie in the North Isles. I hate islands, or I did. When I first met Maggie, and Maggie stays on Bute, when we sailed out across the Clyde, I thought I was going across an ocean. I was told not to be silly. This is the island of Edie. I've shown you the, if you like, geological profile of the island because it's quite interesting. I got a really strong sense of the island as a presence when I was there, and I wanted to capture that in the book. And so throughout the book, you'll see that we have one or two little poems which just detail my feelings for Edie. And I want to read this first one for you. I am Edie, the Isthmus Isle, the connector of tidal lands. My birth is deep in the river of time, my northern rock drawn down from the great Devonian River, feeding ancient Lake Orcady. My southern half compressed from the flooded lake. I am hybrid and yet one, deposited on the face of the earth and held. Through time I have travelled, leaving the haven of the ancient lake, following the North Star slowly, carefully, into the fierce northern seas. And this is the island of Edie from the air. When we first came to Edie, the interview was conducted in over 2 days, and we were flown out, and then we sailed back on one of the tiny passenger boats that run in the summertime. I was completely mystified as to where we were going to land because the airport, you can see the airstrip here, the airstrip at that point was not anything like as sophisticated as this. It was simply a bit of green grass. This kind of westerly arm of the airstrip was full of rabbit holes, and we tried not to land on there if we could, and we mostly tried to land north-south. So we came in on what I thought was a field and headed then up into the island. But let's hesitate for a little bit and begin our journey properly. It takes 4 days in those days to get from Glasgow with a convoy of caravans and ducks and geese and dogs and rabbits and guinea pigs and 4 children. So our third morning begins when we leave Thurso. Our third morning began gently with a sense of peace as we sailed out into the Pentland Firth. A feeling that deepened cruising along the west coast of Hoy and seeing a patchwork of fields in green and gold perched on the cliff tops. A group of low croft houses appeared in a small bay, the name of which I didn't yet know, immediately followed by the giant stack of the Old Man of Hoy dominating the shoreline. There was a permanence about the scene, unmatched by anything in the city. The shore slid slowly past as the boat corkscrewed across the waves, rising and falling in the western swell. The whole experience was like being on a carousel at a fair, going up and down as pictures surround you and events not in your control unfold. Finally, the boat swung easterly into Scapa Flow, and the window on our adventure was opened wide. The low rolling hills of mainland Orkney were very similar to those of my childhood in the borders of Scotland. The little town of Stromness, though, was like nothing I'd seen before. Stone houses tumbling down the steep hillside to crowd the water's edge, some stepping into the waves like rocks jutting into the sea. Little promontories of green were planted with brightly coloured washing lines and white painted derricks for swinging goods up from rowing boats. the blues and reds of their upturned hulls drawn up on the shingle beds between the jetties, caught in the early morning sun. The windows of the shy homes were small, reluctant to let you see what went on inside. There was a permanence in this scene too, an unchanging resilience, stated simply by being. The introduction to Stromness was the beginning of almost a movement back in time. And our fourth day began as we set sail from Kirkwall in this magnificent ship. And Dad will remember this morning because Dad and I went out first to Edie with all of the furniture and carpets. So we got on the Arcadia at 5:30 in the morning to head out with all of the goods for the house. And we were served silver service breakfast in the dining room of this ship. It's really quite a different way to travel. The goods in those days were kept in the holds. This was not the days of ro-ro ferries. This isn't our van. Sadly, I didn't take a picture at the time of our van, but we had a Volkswagen crew bus, the square kind of brick version of this magnificent thing. And they simply hoisted these into the air, let them spin a little bit, and then dropped them into the holds. And I use the word drop advisedly. All of your goods were then stored below decks. And when we got to the other end, we were met by Tom with his tractor and his coal truck, effectively a Bedford truck. And everything was then dragged back out of the hold and put onto the trucks and tractor and taken up to this house. This is the doctor's house in Edie, no longer occupied. There isn't actually a doctor on Edie now. The slightly disturbing thing about these pictures is that we took them 25 years later. So we took these in 2017 when we went back to visit, and they look identical to the house that we inherited, as it were. It was in this sort of condition, and was very nearly the reason why we didn't go to Orkney. We weren't entirely sure that we could live in the house that was being provided. The paintwork that you can see, I'll just go back one, there we are. The paintwork that you can see here with all the brush strokes and roller marks, as far as I can tell, is the paintwork that I put on all those years ago. I couldn't persuade the health board to paint it. They did give me the paint, so I then painted this whole building. It's just sad it hasn't survived 25 years. And this is the house from a distance with Mill Loch below it. And some of these birds that you can maybe just see will be red-throated divers called loons. This is the new surgery, which has been built. This house is abandoned now. The new surgery is here and would be the envy of any surgery anywhere in primary care. The locals call it the cowshed, with typical Arcadian irreverence to the situation. I want to just think a little bit now about the time that we had settling in and the kind of things that I had to learn. That there are several little experiences in the book. The sense of responsibility was really quite overwhelming at the beginning. The fact that you were on call 24/7, the fact that you are totally and entirely responsible for whatever happened because there was no ambulance, there was no hospital down the road. You were going to rely on air transfer either to Kirkwall or to Aberdeen if anything serious had happened. So that took a little bit of getting used to, but after some time we settled to that. And I want to just read you this little bit now. After we've been for a little while on the island, called Night Skies, which illustrates the difficulties of anticipating weather when you're looking after your patients. So I was called to see a chap who was repairing the pier, not a member of the island community. And he phoned me one night to say that he was vomiting blood and could I come and see him, which seemed perfectly reasonable. And so I got packed up and took the car down to see him. The car in those days had anything and everything you could wish to have in it, which was sometimes just as well. But let me just illustrate a little bit of the effect of weather. Outside, the night is one that would be quite impossible to see on the mainland, where the pollutant electric light obscures everything. Here, the black velvet sky is bright with stars that fall all the way to the horizon in every direction. Clouds floating low over the sea have their individuality illuminated from behind, making their edges phosphoresce in the deep blackness. Light captured from the just visible moon waiting behind the horizon, reflecting through the clouds. As I turn slowly down the hill at Bacaland towards the pier, the cream moon eases behind the homes in the east, picking out the single remaining house in the moonlight and suspending it briefly on the sea surface before allowing it to sink again into darkness. There was definitely a reward for doing night visits in places like Orkney, and the reward was very frequently simply the stunning landscape and skies that you saw. So I saw my patient, and I had a bit of a dilemma because he was reasonably well, but still had significant pain, almost certainly had bled from an ulcer. In those days, you would be expected to transfer the patient into surgical care, where they would be observed and managed further. But there was the beginning of a development of medical management of these patients, where you would use high-dose medication to settle the acid in the stomach and allow healing to take place. So I had a little bit of a choice to make, and I wanted to make sure that I got that right. It would be easy on a night like that to fly him in to Kirkwall. But you do have to remember that this is not long after one of the aircraft flying back from a routine flight to Shetland had taken a maternity case down to Aberdeen, had crash landed, killed the pilot and severely injured the nurse and the doctor, putting them both in intensive care. So I suppose I was beginning to become aware of the fact that flying was not just a straightforward choice. Imagine what it would be like to fly through a night like this over a sea sparkling in the moonlight, looking down, watching the lights of crofts and farms twinkling below you as you fly in at 200 feet around each island. A honey trap waiting for the romanticism of the remote life of a country doctor to cloud your judgment, making you forget to balance all the risks while you're distracted by the scenery. Night flying has always been more difficult than daylight. Of course, there are instruments on the little planes to fly by, but much of the skill in landing on the remote airstrip is visual. The grassy strips are nuanced, shaded differently by the light of the moon or invisible in moonless blackness, when they're picked out solely by the light of a few flares roughly marking the limits of the grass. The hidden rising and falling of the ground unexpectedly affects the response of the plane. Only pilots experienced in each individual strip are allowed to land on them at night. So I have that in the back of my mind all the time, and I choose then to keep the patient effectively at home and return back to my own home about 10 o'clock at night with a plan to go back down and see him at 1 in the morning. And one of the reasons I picked this little piece out, was what went through my mind next as I'm sitting and waiting. I'm not going to go to bed until I've been back to see my patient. A little more coal goes on the fire. Peats burn too quickly to keep the stove in overnight. I open my next book on whales, but I'm not ready to read just yet. What did Dr. Mackenzie do when he was waiting through the night? He always seemed so confident when he visited us, but was he? His hospitals were 20 miles away by road, and sometimes in winter we were cut off for days by snowfall. Here I can call a military helicopter if I get approval, or I can ask the lifeboat to come out. Dr. Mackenzie must have had times where he had nothing to do but wait. Is confidence an illusion that we create as doctors, necessary but unreal, lacking in foundation? How do we know when a doctor is not waving, but drowning? It's not something we ever speak about when we're in a group together. Life here feels like taking a continual risk. There's one of the beautiful night skies. There were several of these. I don't know if you can see the bottom of my screen flashing. It's a bit of a nuisance. Magnificent northern lights there, but just beautiful evenings. I chose to keep the patient at home because I reckoned I could fly him quite quickly into hospital because the weather was fantastic. These are the little planes that took us back and forwards, the Loganair Islanders. You had to strip the seats out of the plane before you could carry a passenger in them on a stretcher. So this plane would have been stripped out in the middle of the night. The pilot would then have flown into the strip, which wouldn't have been concrete like this, it would have been grass, and we'd have transferred our patients. So I decided to keep the patient home. What I hadn't realized yet and hadn't learned was that weather in Orkney is not just about wind and gales. It can also be about fog. This is the airstrip, the airport at Edy, as it was when we were there. And you can just see the beginnings of fog coming in. The next morning when I went down to see my patient again, there's no way that we could have flown him anywhere. The fog was so thick, and it does that in Orkney and sits there sometimes for 2 to 3 days. So part of learning to live there was learning to really understand the weather and always to be very cautious about how you made your clinical decisions. Once we settle down into the community, we start to understand a little bit better what actually holds an island together. And there are 3 things, to my mind, that people seemed to really need. 3 pins hold an island on the map and prevent the wind stripping it off into the North Sea: the church, the school, and the surgery. Without these points firmly anchored, a vulnerability develops that nibbles away at confidence, like a field mouse in winter on hot water pipe insulation. With that cooling effect, folks drift towards the warmth and security of mainland. And that was what began to happen in our time as some of the services, if you like, began to be eroded. One of the other key hubs on the island, though, which you won't be familiar with living in the middle of the borders, is the pier. And in those days particularly, the pier was one of the main meeting places in the week. All of your supplies came in once a week off the boat. It would either be the Islander or the Arcadia that you've seen. Everybody would gather on the pier to collect all their goods, whether it was farming implements, whether it was grain, whether it was me picking up the medicines that I'd ordered to come out from Kirkwall. And the whole phenomenon of the pier was central to island life, which was really nice. So the other place that we spoke about was the church. And after I'd been in Edy for a little while, and not very long, I was roped into preaching in the church under the pretext of me being an educated man. I don't quite know where they got that pretext from, but anyway, I was roped in. So this church just sits beside the main road, actually built with windows from the East Kirk in Kirkwall, because up in Orkney you never waste anything. So when you knock down one church, you salvage the windows and send them out to the islands to to build your new church. Actually, preaching in the church was good fun. And I would quite frequently forget or get confused as to whether I was minister or doctor. And one time preaching from the pulpit, I could see Tommy sitting below me at the old-fashioned harmonium pedal organ, pedaling away like fury and popping a sweetie into his mouth as he did it. And then taking the sweetie out and laying it to one side, ready for the next hymn when he popped the sweetie back in. And afterwards I said to him, Tommy, what are you doing with that sweetie? Where did you get it from? He said, you gave it to me, doctor. I said, when did I give you that? He said, it's my angina tablet. He needed to pop the GTN tablet under his tongue to get him through the various hymns. But being Arcadian, didn't want to waste it, so he took it back out when he didn't need to play and then popped it back in again. So we had, Tommy and I had to sort that out, and I brought him back up to the surgery. And again, reading just a little bit from the chapter Hymns of the Heart. Over the next few weeks, I worked with Tommy on his medication. I should really arrange an ECG and probably an exercise test on a treadmill to secure the diagnosis of angina. The first test would have to be done in Kirkwall, and the second would need a trip to Aberdeen. Neither of these tests is really likely to change the way I manage Tommy's condition, so we invent a new test, the pedal organ stress test. How many verses of a standard hymn can Tommy play before he begins to feel discomfort? At the end of our tests, we're up to 6 full verses of Give Heed My Heart to the magnificent arrangement by J.S. Bach. It seemed appropriate for the test, really, to use that song. And actually, we did manage to get Tommy squared up and sort his angina. But that was the reality, that if you needed anything in the way of a specialist test, then you would have to travel. I didn't have an ECG machine at that point. I didn't have a defibrillator. We had only very basic kind of manual equipment. We did very shortly after that manage to persuade the health board to fund us with an ECG defib. But you could easily travel 250 miles for what we would regard as a basic test. So here's a crew. Here's everybody. 4 boys that we moved up with. And one of the things that Maggie and I had to learn to cope with, we got quite a sharp lesson, if you like, was the lesson of resilience in island life. 6 weeks before Megan was born, Maggie had to be flown to Aberdeen as an emergency and suffered a dramatic antenatal hemorrhage. I had to stay on the island because there was no medical cover that can be arranged at short notice at that time. And so we were separated for 6 weeks, and we had to learn to live apart with the anxiety and the potential for a further bleed, which was very real. Just let me hesitate a little minute and take you through what all these folks are doing now. So our eldest boy, who's Martin, now repairs all these fancy bicycles that everybody cycles round on and knows more about gearing than anybody else. Matthew knows everything about mobile phones and will talk the hind legs off a donkey about them. Mike here is actually attempting to blow us all up. He's one of the scientific leads at CERN, looking at one of the main experiments, which is LHCb, if anybody's interested. Petey Person, who you may recognize if you have read the book, down here, is a database manager. He works with Museums Scotland after getting his history degree. And this very small baby here, who is probably 6 weeks at best, maybe not even, is now an anaesthetist in Liverpool at the moment. So you never can tell. But the stress of that episode of having the separation really brought home and was one of the pivot points, if you like, in certainly my life, in understanding when you can do something about things and when you have to let go. And this was probably one of the worst times that I'd spent. The emptiness inside me is now filled with fear of losing Maggie to a further catastrophic bleed. I have to pray, not Sunday school gentle Jesus praying. This is a raw, urgent tantrum of a prayer, a cry driven by the unfairness of being disabled by the island, the injustice of being unable to hold Maggie and lessen her fear of losing the baby. I don't ask for anything in this foot-stamping tirade. I demand it. I demand that God doesn't let Maggie die. I don't threaten anything, to stop believing or stop caring. My inner voice simply shouts, instructs God in what he has to do. My mind is irrationally furious with him for a long time. How dare he stop me holding Maggie? How dare he take her from me? On and on and on until I'm no longer in control. Only then, gradually, to begin with almost imperceptibly, at the height of my tirade, the words come. Not in my head, but around me. Not spoken, but there in my consciousness, even as my rage continues. They form and take shape as the rain on the windows clear and the island sunlight bleeds into the room. Be still and know that I am God. It's then that I cry. And that was really quite a harsh time for us. Perhaps being medical and understanding the full implications of what could happen was one of the real issues. We kept in contact with these letters and Maggie kept them. I sent these down every 2 to 3 days. My writing is considerably better than you would imagine a doctor's writing should be, with some nice italic script there. And these letters were invaluable when we revisited our memories to try and see what we could write about and what some of the facts were. So I'm pleased that Maggie kept those. Eventually we settle in. I'm beginning now to understand that the island is not a place to be isolated. It is a community, it is a place that you rely on people, but it is a place from the past, almost from before I remember being a kid in West Linton in the 60s. When we first went there, they were still stooking the grain, using an old reaper binder to gather the grain in. I think this is probably oats. The picture's not very clear. They would stook it and then they would get oat stacks and hay stacks built very readily. So we were really right back in time. This is Crowber. This is one of the old crofts that our brother and sister stayed in when we were there. It would be considerably tidier than this more recent picture, with living quarters here and sheds for Pete and Bayer, all under the one roof. These people were so used to coping with the elements that they almost didn't notice them. And so we'd settled in, and here we are, settled in. This is our first goat. This is Rhoda. And you can just see Freda underneath here, tucking into some milk. We have a new fence as well. It's a fairly recent addition to the paddock. And one of the reasons for the fence was this. There's nothing better than seeing a full washing line of pristine white nappies blowing in the summer breeze. Lately, however, the wind must be getting stronger, or we're needing new nappies as they're beginning to fray at the ends. This can happen, of course, in the winter time when the winds are really strong, but it's not been that windy lately. I've been out to check the washing line and the surroundings, and there's nothing to snag the nappies that I can see. What I hadn't realised was what was snagging the nappies was Rhoda, because the old fence was so saggy that when the wind was in the right direction, she could lean over and quietly munch her way along the whole line of washing. So we had to get a new fence put in, and it's that fence that I want to just tell you a little bit about now. We couldn't actually build the fence in the way that we'd thought. We had a friend come who had one of these augers that sat on the back of the tractor, who said it would be fine, 10 minutes he would have the strainer posts in, and then we could quite quickly get on and build the fence. When I looked down the field to see how he was getting on, all I could see was that he was getting higher and higher off the ground, as were the back wheels of the tractor, and the auger was going nowhere. He'd made the mistake of thinking that because we were beside a peat bog, we were actually in it, but we weren't. We were obviously on the rock. So he tried for most of the morning and gave up. And then the bush telegraph kicks in, and Willock comes round and says, "You needing a new fence, doctor?" To which I obviously agree. He said his brother would come and put it in. And I said, "Well, I don't know how, because, you know, we can't get it." He said, "Don't worry." And Ivan came, and just watching him using the hand tools to dig into the ground that this machine couldn't get into was fascinating in itself, and told me a lot about how to do things, not necessarily to go hashing at them with big machine tools, but sometimes patience is required. The next day is quieter, and I'm determined to try and see how these holes are dug. 4 holes are complete now. Sitting on the old sagging fence, I watch the swift, accurate descent of the long-handled spade, cutting the outline of the new hole, followed by the removal of the fibrous turf. There's no apparent muscular effort in the careful, deliberate strokes, only a synergy between man and spade persuading the earth to give way. The secret seems to be in the flow of the action, not brute force. Slowly the spade goes deeper, further into the earth, followed by pauses, while Ivan bends down to ease the stones from the soil with his hands. Why haven't I noticed his hands before now? Coarse brown skin covers them, not ingrained with dirt, but simply showing years of labor in all weathers. Strong fingers, impervious to the sharp rocks, obviating the need for leather gloves. Then, once the hole is deep enough, the change to the double spade. One hand on each handle is driven down into the earth. The handles pulled apart and closed as rock and earth are lifted out. Slowly and methodically, the earth gives way, allowing the positioning of the posts. I've seen other farmers elsewhere use JCBs to dig post holes, add special attachments to pile drive in the posts. Here in my paddock is how it's been done for years without the use of hydraulic machines. In fact, the post holes are being dug when machines couldn't. I suppose I'm watching an expression of the resilience of islanders everywhere, getting things done with the minimum of fuss. I never managed to get Ivan to chat, though. In the whole week it's taken him to set the fence, he's only ever exchanged polite good mornings and refusals to come in for a cup of tea. Words, language, aren't a necessary thing for him. He seems to regard them as an intrusion on the world, noise that displaces the peace of the place we're in. Sitting on the grass bank with our backs to the stone wall of the garden, we shelter from the wind and survey the new fence as I hand him his payments for the job. Below us, Mill Loch lies quiet and undisturbed, with the exception of the cries of the loons as they meet up with their mates again, ready to establish their nests for this year. There are times when words are superfluous. Sometimes company is enough. And that was probably one of the most important lessons I had to learn, that some jobs just take time and some things in life take time, and that you shouldn't rush them. So just before I finish, I want to just show you this stone. This is the stone of Setter, which is one of the tallest standing stones in Orkney, and stood maybe about a quarter of a mile away from the doctor's house. And there's just a little piece that I want to mention to you, if I can just find my notes. There's a little fascinating story here, that in and around the middle 18th century, there's said to have been an inscription on this stone, which read, it was in Latin, but the translated read, "Andrew Matheson fled here from the sorcerer Captain Weller in 1755. A ship's surgeon, this Matheson believed his captain held magical powers and that his sorcery was ensnaring him. Terrified, he fled to Edie, but even there felt that Captain Weller's magic was still ensnaring him. And what we found when we were in Orkney was that many people had fled something, that they tried to move away from something, and indeed we had as well, because we tried to move away from city life, from the vagaries, shall we say, of urban practice, and to some extent the vagaries of the partners in the partnership I was in. But to flee is only to take your problems with you, as Andrew Matheson found. He wasn't released. To actually live well in an island, you have to adapt and change. I'll close the book with just another little poem really capturing Edie and what I felt Edie had said to me. I am Edie, the Isthmusile, the connector of tidal lands. Through time I journey in the fierce northern seas. I am flawed, yet whole. I live, drawing all to me, gathering them on my shores, holding them, testing them in the northern winds, until only the sea and the rich black peats remain. The birds sing my shore songs, and the lips of the wind whisper in my grasses. Yet few can hear the truth that lies beneath my electric skies. And we'll probably all have our own thoughts as to what that truth might be, and particularly if you've been on an island, what the truth is in relationship to island life. For me, it's live your life. Don't fight it. You have to learn to go with the tide, because if you don't, the tide will sweep you away. Thank you for listening.